There is a word that the Catholic Church uses for the office of Pope that tells you everything you need to know about the theory of papal authority and nothing about what that authority looked like in practice in Rome in the summer of 1492. The word is vicar. The Pope is the vicar of Christ, the representative of Jesus Christ on earth, the human vessel through which divine authority is channeled into the governance of the Church that Christ founded. It is the most theologically loaded job title in the history of Western civilization. And in August of 1492, the man who held it had just purchased it. The conclave that elected Rodrigo Borgia as Pope Alexander VI in August 1492 was not the most corrupt in the history of the Catholic Church. That is important to establish at the outset, because the history of papal elections contains episodes of such spectacular venality that Borgia's election, brazen as it was, does not stand entirely alone. What distinguished it was not the fact of the corruption but its scale, its directness, and the almost contemptuous openness with which it was conducted. Rodrigo Borgia did not merely hint at rewards for his supporters or allow the normal currents of Renaissance patronage politics to flow in his direction. He negotiated. He offered specific offices, specific territories, specific sums of money to specific cardinals in exchange for specific votes. The Cardinal of Sforza received the vice-chancellorship of the Church, the second most powerful administrative position in the papal government, and 4 mule loads of silver. The mule loads of silver have always struck historians as a detail of almost novelistic precision. Not a bank transfer. Not a letter of credit. 4 mules, loaded with silver, walking through the streets of Rome to the cardinal's palace while the conclave was still nominally deliberating in secret. Rodrigo Borgia had been working toward this moment for most of his adult life. He was born in 1431 in Valencia, in the Kingdom of Aragon, into a family of minor Spanish nobility whose most significant asset was not land or title but a connection. His uncle was Alfonso de Borgia, who in 1455 became Pope Calixtus III. The election of a Borgia uncle to the papacy transformed the family's prospects with the speed that only the specific mechanisms of Renaissance nepotism could produce. Within a year of his uncle's election, Rodrigo Borgia had been appointed a cardinal. He was 25 years old. He had been made one of the princes of the Church, one of the men who would elect the next pope, by the current pope who was his uncle. The circularity of this arrangement was not lost on the Roman public, who had a sophisticated and deeply cynical understanding of how the papal system actually worked. But Rodrigo Borgia was not simply a beneficiary of nepotism who coasted on his uncle's connection. He was genuinely able. Not saintly, not particularly troubled by the gap between the theological demands of his office and the personal life he was leading, but administratively capable, politically intelligent, and possessed of an instinct for power that recognized opportunity and moved toward it with a speed and decisiveness that his contemporaries found both impressive and alarming. He served as vice-chancellor of the Church for 35 years under 4 successive popes, accumulating wealth, influence, and a network of obligations and relationships that extended through every level of the Church's administrative structure. He was also, during these same 35 years, conducting an openly acknowledged series of romantic relationships with women, fathering children, and living in a style of personal luxury that the theoretical demands of clerical celibacy made technically irregular but that the practical culture of the Renaissance Church made entirely unremarkable. His most significant relationship was with a Roman noblewoman named Venosa dei Catanii, who bore him 4 children who would become the central figures in the Borgia story. Cesare, the eldest son, who would become the most feared and most studied political operator of his generation. Juan, the second son, who would be given military commands he lacked the ability to fulfill and would die violently in circumstances that have never been fully explained. Lucrezia, the daughter, who has been accused by legend of crimes that the historical evidence does not support and defended by scholarship that has perhaps overcorrected in the direction of rehabilitation. And Joffre, the youngest, who was peripheral enough to the main events of the Borgia story that history has largely left him alone. When Calixtus III died in 1458, Rodrigo Borgia had been a cardinal for 3 years and was 27 years old. He was not yet powerful enough to be a serious candidate for the papacy himself, but he was already deeply embedded in the political culture of the institution, already accumulating the resources and the relationships that would eventually make his own election possible. He waited. He served. He grew richer and more influential with each passing year and each passing pontificate. And he watched the institution he served with the specific attention of a man who intends to run it one day and wants to understand exactly how it works before he does. What he saw, over 35 years of observation from the inside, was an institution of staggering wealth and political power that was simultaneously deeply dysfunctional, chronically corrupt, and entirely resistant to the reform impulses that periodically convulsed it from within. The papacy of the 15th century was not the papacy of the early church, the community of believers gathered around the teachings of Christ in the radical simplicity of the 1st century. It was a Renaissance monarchy, governing a territorial state in central Italy called the Papal States, conducting foreign policy, fighting wars, collecting taxes, dispensing justice, and managing a bureaucratic apparatus of considerable complexity. The spiritual functions of the office, the theological leadership of the Christian world, the pastoral care of the faithful, were not absent, but they existed alongside the temporal functions in a relationship that the more reform-minded observers of the Church found deeply troubling and that the more pragmatic operators, like Rodrigo Borgia, regarded as simply the way things were. The wealth of the Renaissance papacy was extraordinary. Pilgrims came to Rome from across the Christian world and left money. The sale of indulgences, the remission of sins in exchange for financial contributions, generated revenues that flowed upward through the Church's administrative structure to Rome. The appointment to church offices, bishoprics, abbesses, canonries, carried fees that the papal government collected with the efficiency of any well-organized tax system. The papal states themselves generated agricultural revenues, tolls, and the economic output of a medium-sized Italian territorial state. And over all of this sat the Pope, the ultimate authority in the distribution of these revenues and the appointment of the officers who collected them. Rodrigo Borgia understood this system with the precision of a man who had spent 35 years administering it. When he finally entered the conclave of 1492 as a serious candidate for the papacy, he was not improvising. He was executing a plan that had been developing, in one form or another, for most of his adult life. The mule loads of silver that went to Cardinal Sforza were not a last-minute inducement. They were the final payment in a negotiation that had been conducted with considerable sophistication over the weeks and months preceding the conclave. When the votes were counted and Rodrigo Borgia emerged as Pope Alexander VI, he had not stumbled into the most powerful office in the Western world. He had bought it, methodically, deliberately, and at considerable expense. And he intended to make the investment pay. What happened next, over the 11 years of Alexander VI's pontificate from 1492 to 1503, was one of the most extraordinary and most damaging episodes in the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. Not because Alexander was uniquely evil, though the charges against him are serious and many are well documented, but because the Borgia pontificate crystallized, in a way that previous corrupt papacies had not quite managed, the contradiction at the heart of an institution that claimed divine authority while being operated by very human beings with very human appetites for power, money, and the perpetuation of their own family's interests. Alexander VI did not create that contradiction. He embodied it so completely, so visibly, and so unapologetically that it became impossible to ignore. And the impossibility of ignoring it set in motion a chain of events that would eventually produce Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation, and the permanent fracturing of Western Christianity into the denominational landscape that still defines it today. But that is getting ahead of the story. In the summer of 1492, the mules had delivered their silver, the votes had been cast, and Rodrigo Borgia was pope. The question now was what he intended to do with the office he had just purchased. The answer, which would unfold over the next 11 years in a succession of events that combined the political thriller, the family drama, and the theological scandal into something that even the most cynical observers of Renaissance Rome found difficult to fully anticipate, began with a single overriding priority that Alexander VI never abandoned from the first day of his pontificate to the last. The Borgias were going to matter. Not just him. All of them. His children, his relatives, his family. The papacy was not going to be an office that Rodrigo Borgia held. It was going to be an instrument that the Borgia family used. And he was going to use it with every resource, every connection, every tool of spiritual and temporal power that the most powerful office in the Western world placed at his disposal. God's representative on earth had a family to take care of. And he intended to take very good care of them indeed. The first thing Alexander VI did after his election was consolidate. This is what powerful men do when they acquire power. They secure what they have before they reach for more. In the case of a Renaissance pope, consolidation meant appointments. The papal government was an enormous administrative machine that ran on patronage, and the new pope controlled the patronage. Within months of his election, Alexander had appointed his son Cesare as Archbishop of Valencia, his son Juan as Duke of Gandia, and distributed a range of lesser appointments among relatives, allies, and the cardinals whose support he needed to maintain. The nepotism was not subtle. It was not intended to be subtle. In the political culture of Renaissance Rome, a pope who did not take care of his family was not admired for his impartiality. He was considered weak. Alexander VI was not weak. He was not going to be considered weak. And the appointments flowed accordingly. Cesare Borgia was 19 years old when his father became pope and 18 when he was made Archbishop of Valencia, an appointment that gave him an income from the archdiocese's revenues without requiring him to actually perform the functions of an archbishop, which was entirely standard for the period in which Cesare, who had no particular interest in ecclesiastical administration and a great deal of interest in politics and warfare, found perfectly satisfactory. He was made a cardinal the following year, at 20, which made him one of the youngest cardinals in the history of the Church, and which he also found perfectly satisfactory as a source of income and status while he worked out what he actually wanted to do with his life. What Cesare Borgia actually wanted to do with his life became clearer over the following years, and it had very little to do with the Church. He was, by every account of people who knew him, an extraordinary physical specimen. Tall, powerfully built, possessed of the kind of personal magnetism that contemporaries described in terms that bordered on the supernatural. He was also intelligent, ruthless, entirely unburdened by conventional moral constraints, and possessed of a political instinct that recognized the gap between stated principles and actual power with a clarity that made him simultaneously fascinating and terrifying to everyone who dealt with him. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person that the Italian political landscape of the late 15th century rewarded most generously, and exactly the kind of person that a father who was also the Pope could do the most for. The political landscape that the Borgias were navigating was one of extraordinary complexity. The Italian peninsula of the 1490s was not a unified state. It was a collection of competing city-states, principalities, kingdoms, and the papal states themselves, each pursuing its own interests in a constantly shifting system of alliances and conflicts that made Renaissance Italian politics one of the most sophisticated and most dangerous political environments in European history. Florence under the Medicis, Venice with its merchant oligarchy, Milan under the Sforzas, Naples under its Aragonese kings, and Rome under the Pope were the major players, each with its own army, its own diplomatic network, its own economic interests, and its own appetite for territorial expansion at the expense of its neighbors. Into this landscape came the French. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy with an army of 30,000 men, the largest military force the peninsula had seen in generations, claiming the Kingdom of Naples as his inheritance through a complex genealogical argument that the Neapolitan ruling family found entirely unconvincing. The French invasion scrambled the existing political arrangements of the peninsula and created both threats and opportunities for the Borgias that Alexander navigated with considerable skill. He initially opposed the French advance, then accommodated it when opposition proved impractical, then worked to limit French influence once the immediate military threat had passed. The political flexibility this required was not admirable in any conventional moral sense, but it was impressive as a demonstration of pragmatic statecraft, and pragmatic statecraft was what the situation demanded. It was in this context of constant Italian political instability that Cesare Borgia began his transformation from reluctant cardinal to the most feared political and military operator on the peninsula. In 1498, with his father's full support and encouragement, Cesare resigned his cardinalate, an unusual but not unprecedented act, and reinvented himself as a secular lord and military commander. He traveled to France, where he negotiated the support of the new French King Louis XII, receiving in exchange the French Duchy of Valentinois, which gave him the title by which Machiavelli would refer to him, Illinois Valentino. He returned to Italy with French military backing and began the systematic conquest of the Romagna, a region of central Italy to the northeast of Rome that was nominally part of the Papal States but had been governed for generations by a collection of local lords whose relationship with papal authority was at best theoretical. The campaign that Cesare conducted through the Romagna between 1499 and 1502 was one of the most efficient pieces of military and political consolidation in Italian Renaissance history. He moved fast, he moved decisively, and he combined military force with political intelligence in proportions that varied according to what each situation required. Some cities surrendered without fighting when they understood that resistance was futile. Others required siege operations that Cesare conducted with professional competence. The local lords who had governed the region were displaced, killed, or reduced to dependence on Borgia favor. And in the territories he conquered, Cesare installed administrators and legal frameworks that contemporary observers, including Machiavelli who visited him during this period and was simultaneously repelled and fascinated, found more efficient and more just than the government of the lords he had replaced. Machiavelli's engagement with Cesare Borgia is one of the most consequential intellectual encounters in the history of political thought. The Florentine diplomat met Cesare on several occasions during diplomatic missions to the Romagna and was struck by qualities that he found both admirable and disturbing. The speed of decision. The absolute willingness to use violence when violence was the most effective tool and to use other means when they were more effective. The total subordination of moral considerations to political effectiveness. The refusal to be bound by conventional expectations about how a ruler should behave when those expectations conflicted with the requirements of actual power. Machiavelli wrote about Cesare in his dispatches to Florence with a mixture of alarm and admiration that would eventually find its way, transformed and generalized, into The Prince, the political treatise that Machiavelli dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici but whose central argument was drawn, more than from any other single source, from his observation of Cesare Borgia in the field. The Prince is often described as a manual for tyranny. It is more accurately described as an analysis of power, specifically of the gap between how power presents itself and how power actually operates. And the person whose career most clearly demonstrated that gap, in Machiavelli's observation and in the political reality of early 16th century Italy, was Cesare Borgia, the son of the Pope, the cardinal who resigned his cardinalate to become a warlord. The man who used his father's spiritual authority and his own military capacity to build a personal territorial state in the heart of the Italian peninsula, and who came closer than anyone else of his generation to achieving the political unification of Italy under a single ruler. He failed, and the failure, when it came, was as sudden and as complete as the success had been rapid and impressive. In August 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. The circumstances of his death have been disputed ever since and have generated one of the most persistent legends in the history of the papacy. The legend says that Alexander and Cesare were poisoned at a dinner party, possibly by wine they had intended for another guest, possibly as the result of a conspiracy by their enemies, possibly through the accidental ingestion of the cantarella, the poison that the Borgias were alleged to keep for use against their political opponents. The historical evidence for the poison theory is thin. The most likely explanation for Alexander's death is malaria, which was endemic in Rome in summer and which killed many people in the city that August, including several other guests from the same dinner. But the Borgias had accumulated enough enemies and enough of a reputation for poisoning their opponents that the legend was irresistible and has never entirely died. What is not disputed is the consequence. When Alexander VI died, Cesare Borgia's entire political and military position collapsed with a speed that demonstrated how completely it had depended on his father's power rather than on foundations of his own. The papal authority that had legitimized his conquests, the financial resources of the papacy that had funded his armies, the political protection that his father's office had provided against the enemies he had made throughout Italy, all of it evaporated the moment Alexander breathed his last. The new pope, Pius III, died after 26 days in office. His successor, Julius II, was a man who had spent the Borgia pontificate in exile precisely because he was one of the cardinals whom Rodrigo Borgia had not been able to buy or intimidate into compliance, and who had personal reasons of considerable force to ensure that the Borgia family's influence over the papacy ended permanently. Cesare found himself stripped of his territories, his armies, his political allies, and eventually his freedom. He was arrested, escaped, fled to Spain, and died in 1507 at the age of 31, killed in a minor skirmish in Navarre, unhorsed and surrounded by enemies who did not know who he was until they turned over the body and found beneath the ordinary armor the physical evidence of the extraordinary man inside it. He had gone from being the most feared political operator in Italy to dying anonymously in a provincial fight in less than 4 years. The speed of the fall was proportional to the height of the rise, and both were a function of the same thing. The papacy. The office that his father had purchased and that had made everything possible, and whose loss had made everything impossible. Meanwhile, in Rome, the story of the Borgias had one more chapter that history has treated with considerably more complexity than the straightforward narrative of papal corruption and dynastic ambition that the male Borgias provide. The chapter belongs to Lucrezia, and it requires its own careful telling. Lucrezia Borgia has been one of the most persistently misrepresented figures in the history of the Renaissance. The legend that has attached itself to her name over 5 centuries is one of the most vivid and most durable in the entire catalogue of historical villainy. Poisoner, seductress, incestuous conspirator. The woman who wore a hollow ring filled with poison that she deployed against enemies at dinner parties. The woman who conducted sexual relationships with her father and her brother. The woman whose 3 marriages were punctuated by murders that she either committed or arranged with the casual efficiency of someone for whom killing was a domestic convenience. The legend is so vivid, so detailed, and so cinematically satisfying that it has survived 5 centuries of historical scholarship that has dismantled almost every specific element of it. The ring almost certainly never existed. The incest charges were almost certainly political weapons deployed by the Borgias' enemies rather than documented facts. The murders attributed to her are either undocumented or demonstrably the work of other people. Lucrezia Borgia, the historical figure as opposed to the legend, was not the monster that 5 centuries of storytelling have made her. She was, however, something considerably more interesting and considerably more tragic than the monster. She was a young woman of genuine intelligence and considerable personal grace who spent the first 20 years of her life being used as a political instrument by the men of her family, married and married again as the shifting political calculations of the Borgia project required, with minimal reference to her own preferences and at considerable personal cost. And she spent the last 17 years of her life, in Ferrara, as the Duchess of Este, building a court of genuine cultural distinction, patronizing poets and artists with a generosity and discrimination that her contemporaries recognized as the work of someone who understood culture rather than merely purchasing it, and demonstrating in her actual conduct as a ruler a combination of administrative competence, personal kindness, and genuine piety that sits in such complete contradiction to the legend that the 2 versions of the same woman seem to belong to entirely different stories. The political uses to which Lucrezia was put in her early years were not unusual by the standards of Renaissance dynastic politics. The daughters of powerful families were routinely married to create alliances, and the specific circumstances of a family whose power rested on the papacy rather than on hereditary territorial holdings made the marriage of daughters an even more central tool of political strategy than it was for most dynasties. Lucrezia's first betrothal was arranged when she was 10 years old and dissolved before it was consummated when the political circumstances that had made it advantageous changed. Her first actual marriage, to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro, was contracted in 1493 when she was 13 and dissolved in 1497 when the Borgia alliance with the Sforzas had become politically inconvenient. The dissolution of the first marriage was handled in a way that tells you a great deal about how the Borgia men thought about Lucrezia and how little her own experience of the situation mattered to their calculations. The grounds chosen for the annulment were the impotence of Giovanni Sforza, a charge that required Lucrezia to testify to her own virginity and that subjected her to a humiliating examination by a panel of matrons appointed to verify her claim. Giovanni Sforza, furious at the impotence charge, retaliated by spreading the incest accusations against Lucrezia and her father and brother that have followed her reputation ever since. The accusations were almost certainly invented, the revenge of a humiliated man who had been discarded by a more powerful family and who understood that the most damaging thing he could say about a woman in Renaissance Italy was something that implicated her sexuality. They worked. Not in any legal or political sense, the annulment went through regardless, but in the court of historical reputation, where they have clung to Lucrezia's name with a persistence that no amount of contrary evidence has been able to fully dislodge. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, the illegitimate son of the King of Naples, was contracted in 1498 and was, by the accounts of those who observed it, a genuinely happy one. Lucrezia appears to have been genuinely fond of Alfonso and he of her. They had a child together. And then, in August 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica by a group of assassins, wounded but not killed. He was taken to recover in the Borgia apartments in the Vatican, where Lucrezia nursed him. When he was well enough to sit up in bed, he was strangled in his room by Cesare Borgia's captain Michelotto Corella, on orders from Cesare, in front of witnesses who were powerless to intervene. The reason for the murder was political. Alfonso's Aragonese connections had become inconvenient to Cesare's evolving political strategy in Naples. The fact that Alfonso was Lucrezia's husband and the father of her child was not a consideration that entered Cesare's calculation with sufficient weight to alter the outcome. Lucrezia's response to the murder of her second husband is recorded in the accounts of contemporaries who described her grief as genuine and devastating. She was 20 years old. She had been used as a political instrument since childhood, subjected to a humiliating annulment process, had her reputation destroyed by a vindictive former husband, and now watched her brother murder the man she loved for reasons of political convenience. She was given no choice in any of this. She had no power to prevent any of it. She was, in the most literal sense, property. Valuable property, carefully managed property, property whose feelings were occasionally noted by observers with a sympathy that never translated into anything more practical, but property nonetheless. Her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, was arranged in 1501 when she was 21 and was the most politically significant of the three, matching a Borgia daughter to one of the most established noble families in Italy. The Este family were not enthusiastic about the match. Alfonso's father Ursule wrote to his ambassador in Rome asking for an honest assessment of Lucrezia's character and received a report that described her intelligence, her grace, her conversational ability, and her genuine religious devotion in terms that suggested the ambassador found the gap between her reputation and her actual person considerable and worth reporting. The marriage went ahead despite the Este family's reservations, because the political and financial terms Alexander VI offered were sufficiently generous to overcome their social reluctance to ally themselves with the Borgias. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara in January 1502 and began the 17 years of her life there that constitute, by any honest historical assessment, her real story. The court she built at Ferrara was one of the most significant centers of Renaissance culture in Italy. She patronized Pietro Bembo, the greatest Italian poet of his generation, with whom she maintained an intellectually intense correspondence that has survived and that reveals a woman of genuine literary sensibility and philosophical depth. She patronized Ariosto, who dedicated Orlando Furioso to her husband and acknowledged her patronage. She managed the affairs of the duchy with administrative competence during her husband's frequent absences, dealing with financial problems, legal disputes, and the practical governance of a territorial state with a capability that her contemporaries noted without apparent surprise, as though competent female governance was something they had been led to expect from her. She converted to a deepening personal piety in her later years that expressed itself not as the performative religiosity of the politically ambitious but as a genuine engagement with Franciscan spirituality that included the wearing of a hair shirt beneath her court dress, extended periods of private prayer, and a relationship with the Franciscan community of Ferrara that her biographers have consistently found difficult to reconcile with the legend of the poisoning seductress. She died in 1519, at 39 years old, from complications following the birth of her fifth child, having spent the final decade of her life in a manner that her contemporaries consistently described with words like pious, generous, and beloved. The Borgia story did not end with Lucrezia's death or with Cesare's. It ended, in the most significant sense, with the Protestant Reformation that the Borgia pontificate helped make inevitable. Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg in 1517, 2 years before Lucrezia died in Ferrara and 14 years after Alexander VI died in Rome. The specific grievances that Luther articulated, the sale of indulgences, the corruption of the papal court, the gap between the church's spiritual claims and its temporal conduct, were not new grievances. They had been articulated by reformers for generations before Luther. What was new was the historical moment and the technology. The printing press meant that Luther's arguments reached an audience that previous reformers had never been able to access, and the specific outrages of the Borgia pontificate had done something to that audience that previous outrages had not quite managed. They had made the corruption of the papacy impossible to defend with a straight face. Alexander VI had not been the first corrupt pope. He had not been the most theologically heterodox or the most politically ruthless or the most personally dissolute. What he had been was the most visible. The Borgia pontificate had happened at a moment of increasing literacy, increasing political consciousness, and increasing willingness among educated Europeans to question institutions whose authority rested on claims that their conduct made difficult to sustain. The mule loads of silver that had gone to Cardinal Sforza in 1492 had been noted. The appointments of teenage sons to archbishoprics had been noted. The murder of Alfonso of Aragon in the Vatican apartments had been noted. The orgies that allegedly took place in the papal court, some documented and some invented by enemies but all circulating in the increasingly connected information environment of early 16th century Europe, had been noted. And what they added up to, in the minds of the educated European public that Luther was addressing in 1517, was an institution that had forfeited its claim to moral authority so completely that the question of whether that authority could be reformed from within or needed to be replaced from without had become genuinely open. Luther answered the question one way. The Council of Trent, convened by the Catholic Church between 1545 and 1563 to address the Reformers' criticisms, answered it another. The fracturing of Western Christianity into Catholic and Protestant traditions that resulted from this conflict, the wars of religion that followed, the political and social upheaval that reshaped European civilization for the next 2 centuries, all of it traces a line back, not exclusively but meaningfully, to the summer of 1492 when 4 mule loads of silver walked through the streets of Rome and Rodrigo Borgia became the vicar of Christ. The Borgias did not cause the Reformation, but they made it easier. They made the argument that the church needed to be broken before it could be fixed more compelling than it would otherwise have been. They provided the critics of the papacy with material so vivid and so damning that no amount of theological sophistication could fully neutralize it. They were, in the most precise historical sense, a gift to the Protestant cause, delivered by a man who had no idea he was making a gift and who would have been appalled to know that his legacy would be measured not in the territories his son conquered or the marriages his daughter contracted, but in the permanent fracturing of the institution he had spent his entire life ascending to the top of. God's representative on earth had purchased the office to take care of his family. He ended up breaking the church he was supposed to represent. The mule loads of silver were the most expensive investment in the history of Western Christianity, and nobody who loaded them got what they paid for.